Hello and welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the vlogcast that gives you a peek inside the minds of some truly inspirational teachers. During this episode, I sit down for a chat with Lisa Coe, a mathematics specialist in Norfolk, who shares her experience of teaching and leading in the east of England, how time away from the classroom reframed her approach to teaching, and what must be a fraction of the mathematical expertise she has developed over many years. Whether you're new to teaching or a school leader with tons of experience, this interview is a must listen. And if you happen to be listening on your preferred podcast provider, don't miss out on the extended cut in which Lisa takes on the manipulative tier list, ranking some of her favourite mathematical manipulatives. Full interviews are available from the Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics YouTube channel or thinkingdeeply.info, where full show notes and references can be found. And without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. We normally start the show, in inverted commas, with our guests in numbers. So I've got some questions and you can only answer with numbers. And the first one is years as a teacher.
6 1/3.
Number of schools?
2.
Last year group taught?
4 and 5.
Book reviews?
29.
Yes, I actually went back to the site the other night. I was impressed by how many there were.
I did a quick count up. I'm sad that there's not 30. I'm not a fan of 29. I need to get another one in before Christmas, I think.
I can think of one that could be done for.
Yeah, it's on my list. It's on the top of my pile.
Favorite year group?
5.
Most important year group?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Interesting answer.
I think if you're going to hold me to one, I 3 and 4. That's as close as I can get.
So I'm with you there. And tweets?
17,300.
Wow. Every time I ask someone, I'm like, oh, they've got like tens of thousands more than, I think I'm on like 3,000 or 4,000.
I mean, it has been since 2016, so that's, it's a fair while. But yeah, I looked this morning and I was a bit shocked at how many there were. So yeah, lots of tweets.
That's impressive. And so you're currently maths lead for a trust in Norfolk.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Tell us about your journey as a teacher and how you got there.
So I describe this to lots of people as luck and fluke. But actually, I think that there is a lot of hard work and a lot of effort that's gone into it. But I have been really lucky in some of the things that have happened. So I started off, obviously, as an NQT. I worked for 6 years in the same school. And while I was, to get my NQT job, I had to do a maths problem-solving lesson. And so when I got the job, the head teacher said to me, "Oh, you did a wonderful lesson. We'll put you in the maths team." So in my school, we had specific leads, but we also had then everyone had a role to play in developing a subject. So we had teams and so on. And I was a bit miffed because I have an English degree. I was really passionate about grammar and reading. And I was like, okay, fine. But you do as you're told as an NQT. And I grew to love it. So I grew to love maths and the teaching of maths. And the more my understanding grew, the more passionate I got about it, really. And then after 6 years, I was in a comfortable rut in my school, didn't really know what I wanted to do, wasn't sure if teaching in its kind of day-to-day fashion was what I wanted to carry on doing. So I resigned with no job to go to, which was, the scariest thing I've ever done. But luckily, I found the job advertisement for Mathematics Mastery, which I know we're going to talk a little bit more about later. And I got the job and spent 4 years there working as a maths lead and learning a huge amount from amazing people about maths and the pedagogy. And all the bits and pieces. And I was really lucky. I got to go and work with well over 100 schools in those 4 years, all across the country. So I think I've seen independent schools, I've seen schools with, massive social deprivation and everywhere in between. And I've worked with schools from Kent to Northern Ireland, and everywhere in between. So that was a really nice experience. But again, after about 3 years, I was sort of getting a bit itchy feet. The traveling was great, but hard. So two of the schools that I worked with were the Inspiration Trust schools, which is where I am now. And as part of that, I met the director of maths, and he was a secondary mathematician. Obviously, they've got primary schools. And so he approached me around this idea of having a primary person in their team. And then he let me know when the job was interviewing. And so I interviewed for it. And as of September, that's where I've been. So yeah, it's been lucky in the sense that I've met the right people at the right time. I've seen the right adverts at the right time. And I've been lucky enough to be interviewed and get the jobs that I've been looking for. But I know that I've put a lot of work in terms of developing my understanding. But yeah, I usually just go for luck.
Yeah, no, to be fair, I often say, I was quite fortunate, but actually then people who are sort of looking after me say, no, don't put yourself down. So I'm glad that you acknowledge that you do work very hard.
Yeah, I've learned a lot, and I've applied myself a lot to thinking deeply about maths for a long time now. And so I know that it is my subject knowledge and my pedagogical knowledge and everything else that has set me up for these roles. But equally, I have just been very lucky in the people that I've met and the opportunities that I've had that have meant that I'm able to do the job that I love now. So yeah, very lucky.
It's really interesting you say about not initially wanting to get involved in maths, but actually being totally overcome by it. And I've had this conversation with people before. What do you reckon it is about maths? Is it because it's so rich in pedagogy and it's sort of, it's a part of culture as well to an extent? What do you think it is about maths that absorbs people into it? Because they do go 100% in, don't they?
I think partly because maths is everything and it's everywhere. And I think, I liked the language side of English. So I did, in the last year of my degree, I did a whole paper about Mrs. Dalloway and the use of modal verbs, which ironically, first time I'd ever heard of a modal verb. And now obviously we do them in year 5, year 6. But anyway, but I think that in itself is more about pattern seeking. It's more about being able to generalize and look for rules and things like that. And so in a way, that is that mathematical thinking. And so I think I've always been quite logically minded. And I was really lucky. Before my PGCE, I went on a 7-day intensive maths course. It was kind of an intervention for people who had only just scraped the maths test that we had to do to get into the PGCE. I had been fine with the maths test, but they invited me because I was moving to Manchester, and they thought it'd be a nice opportunity to meet people. But in that course, I just learned so much. I learned about chunking as an option for division, and I learned that the procedures that I knew that made me able to do maths were not actually maths. They were just tricks and procedures. And I think the more you learn about the different ways of thinking about maths, the more obsessed you get about it. And then the more you kind of strive to find the perfect way of doing something. Not that there ever is, I don't think. But yeah, I think it's just that generalizing and that pattern seeking and that excitement. I get excited by maths these days, and I'm not ashamed to admit that.
No, definitely. You shouldn't be either. Yeah, I can see that because I'm quite interested in language and, through the stuff we've done on storytelling, looking at where language came from. And I think there definitely are a lot of similarities in how things behave with each other and stuff and the relationships.
Yeah. I think it's the enthusiasm that you get from the maths world, and we're quite a small world, so particularly here there's a lady I work with who's part of the maths hub here, who I used to work with because she was a maths lead in one of the schools I taught. And there's various other connections with people, and you realize that actually the maths community, particularly primary maths, is small but wonderful. So yeah, I think we're a great bunch.
Yeah, I agree. And so one of the reasons for these sort of interviews is to sort of explore teaching and learning. What are the four most prominent sort of parts or features of a LISA lesson?
I like a LISA lesson. I think it's really evolved over time. And I think there are things that I do in lots of different ways. So I know perhaps some people will respond to this with like set sort of structures or patterns, whereas mine is more themes, I suppose. So the first one being language. I think it's vital that the children know and understand the language that we use in mathematics. You need to be able to speak like a mathematician. So language is a really important feature of all my lessons, whether that be introducing them to the vocabulary, whether that be doing lots of I say, you say type modelling, whether that be, actually literally teaching them those words like you would in a grammar lesson, really diving into the etymology and so on. And so language is something that I have very high expectations with. I'm constantly reinforcing and correcting the children and thinking about how we can best introduce that. So language is one of the key threads, I suppose, running through all of my lessons. The second one would be making connections. So Mike Askew, who I'm actually going to mention later on, talks about the importance of being a connectionist teacher in maths. And that, when I read that and when I sort of really thought about that, it really struck a chord with me, because maths is completely interconnected and I'm still learning ways in which it's connected. And so I am constantly reinforcing connections in my lessons. So that might be to, look at what we did yesterday. It might be to, isn't this similar or different to what we did whenever? And also thinking about how I can connect forward as well. So I might say to the children, not just remember this because it's important, but everything's important. But that idea of, just kind of keep this in mind, and I will make a note of it so that I can return to it in the future. And so I think making those connections really explicit to the children is very important. The third theme is representation. So representations, it's been really hard in the COVID life to use manipulatives, but we've done what we can. So all of my lessons will have representations of some kind in them, whether that be pictures or whether that be concrete stuff. Thinking about how to expose those children to the underlying relationships and underlying concepts through those representations. So if I don't have a representation in my lesson, something's gone very wrong. And then I think the final sort of theme is reasoning. So this has kind of come from the sort of mathematical thinking understanding that I've done a lot of working with Maths Mastery, and something that I don't see a lot of in classrooms, having been to so many of them. So I try really hard to ensure that there is that mathematical thinking opportunities and reasoning opportunities. And that crops up in so many different ways. So it might be through using variation, it might be through the questions that I ask or the expectations on children to say, well, why? It might be as simple as, well, what do you notice? That kind of thing. But I make sure that all of my lessons just have that element in it. And it's not just me telling them, it's about them thinking about those connections and making those links themselves. So yeah, rather than specific parts, I have themes, I think.
Yeah, no, there's no, I have no design in mind for the answers to the question. And I think, I could definitely get on board with all of those as fundamental. So when you're talking about the connections, what would your advice be to anybody who's not 100% sure about those connections? Where would they go for inspiration?
That's a tricky one. I think there are a lot of books and so on that will support that. I think the new NCTM Ready to Progress document is pretty good for that as well. So obviously we've got that new non-stack guidance that has making connections written in it, but it also allows you to see that kind of snapshot of those key things and allows you to make those links. But I also think it's about exploring for yourself. So it's also about noticing yourself, doing the maths yourself. And I know that must be, I've had the luxury of time to be able to do that. And as a full-time class teacher, probably won't have happened. But being open to thinking about things, and also Twitter. I mean, I've learned so much from Twitter, particularly early years stuff, because that's my sort of less known area. Being able to read blogs and so on and so forth has opened my eyes to the possibilities of connections. So I think lots of different ways. I think as a teacher starting out, asking people as well, asking your maths lead, getting involved with maths comps and things like that, and just having time set aside for once you've asked those questions to actually think about it, which I know can be really hard to find.
Yeah. So what they need is their sort of mentors giving them the time to think about it and stuff, don't they? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that can be, it's so tricky. I can quite happily sit here and say, oh yes, spend an hour a week thinking about maths, but actually, when you've got all the other things you have to think about as a teacher, finding an hour a week can be really challenging, So it's hard. But I think if you want to enable those connections, and I think they're really important, then I think that you do need to invest a bit of time, because you only need to do it once, really, in a sense. You only need to think about how area models are linked to that kind of bus stop division thing, that kind of having one line, a horizontal and vertical line, and that linking to an area model. You only have to think about that once, and then it's there forever. And then you can link it to other things. But I think it is worth investing the time, I think. Yeah,
definitely. They're all great. I think that's great advice. And then just teaching in as many year groups as well, not necessarily in one big go, but a couple of years in 3, a couple of years in 4, and those things sort of start to reveal themselves. I took some of our TAs through GCSE a couple of years ago.
Oh wow!
And in teaching them GCSE, I could say, oh my goodness, that thing from year 4, that thing from year 5, it all started to tie up, and then you're thinking about forward facing and stuff, and so I think just more experience, which is easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think being able to converse with secondary colleagues can be really useful as well, actually. Maths Mastery had a secondary arm, and although I never worked directly with the secondary team, when they were looking at rewriting year 7, year 8 materials, of course, as primary people, were useful for thinking about how those kind of key themes and ideas work their way through the curriculum.
And in terms of school leadership, how do you try, because that's a big part of your role as well, isn't it? How do you try and instigate change on a school-wide level?
So thinking about the current role, obviously it's only been since September. I feel like I've been there forever. But so I think at the moment it's about building good relationships with people. So I am lucky in that the 5 maths leads of the 5 primary schools are all awesome. They're very knowledgeable, willing to learn and reflect. But it's really important for me, if I want them to develop the maths teaching across their schools, I need to have buy-in from them and their principals. And so I think building really good relationships is key. And that was the same with mathematics mastery as well. If the school leads in school and the head teachers liked and respected me, then it made a massive difference in terms of how I could kind of persuade them to develop the areas that we were thinking about. And I think as well, it's I've learned so far in this new role, we've had a lot of, there are things that need to change. There are lots of things that need to change in the primary schools to develop maths teaching. And I think I've learned already that, that's going to happen. That's going to take time. And so it's about careful prioritization and thinking about, okay, what can we do and what is the time frame? Because teachers need to be able to sit with things. They need to be able to, if I introduce variation theory and a new curriculum and this and that and all the stuff in one go, then they can't spin all those plates. So careful thinking about, okay, this is what needs to change, what's our end goal, and therefore what can we put in and when, so that teachers have time to let it sit and simmer with themselves before launching into something else.
Yeah, having that plan, what can we change, what do we get the most benefit from addressing first, and then building on it.
Yeah, so for me at the moment, it's we're developing the curriculum. So the trust has a trust curriculum, and one of the first things I did was actually review it, and I discovered that actually there were some really amazing things in there, and there's some really lovely sequencing and progression, but actually there were some things that were missing, and there were some ideas and concepts that just weren't in, that meant that, in my opinion, some of the children who are getting up to year 5 and year 6 are kind of missing some of those important aspects. And so job number one really is for me that, if you want the maths teaching in schools to be brilliant, then what they're teaching from needs to be as good as it can be. And so at the moment we're working on developing the curriculum so that it's more fit for purpose, I suppose.
And so you say we, does that mean you've got a team of you? So tell me about that process. That's really interesting.
No. So the trust, the way the trust works, and I don't know really if this is how all trusts work, but with our trust we have central teams. So we have central subject teams. So we have an English team, maths team, and so on and so forth. And the maths team has existed for a while, but they, in fact, across the whole trust, it has primarily had secondary practitioners in, which is obviously amazing in terms of subject and pedagogical knowledge. And actually the wider curriculum stuff is phenomenal for that. It's got so much depth of knowledge and it's brilliant. But the problem with the maths curriculum is that while the knowledge is there, the actual how to put that into practice at a primary level was kind of missing. So I am currently the only member of the central subject team who is primary practitioner. So it's kind of me, but I have, obviously, as I mentioned, I've got the 5 maths leads in school who, while they still obviously teach day to day and everything else, they're often my sounding board. So at the moment, we're at the point where I have organised all the objectives in each year group into what I think would be a sensible order, and I've sent it out to them, and it's their job now to critique and everything else. And because I have built up that relationship with those people, it means that if I am going off the deep end, and if I have made very strange choices, they are in a position where they can challenge me, and they will challenge me. So it's so although it is me, I feel like a team of one sometimes. My secondary colleagues are amazing because they will listen, but it's sometimes tricky when I'm sort of talking about particularly lower end of the school. Their kind of understanding of how maths is taught is a bit limited.
Yeah, I get you. That sounds fascinating though, because I'd love to do that, but I think my office would end up, with like paper all over the walls and string coming from different bits and stuff.
How it looks at the moment, I have massive bits of flip chart paper with the original concept maps in the middle, and then like no string yet, but lots of different colours. And then I've got other bits of paper with the ready to progress statements on. Yeah, I have a lovely office, which is I'm very lucky to have an office in the school I work in, and it is progressively getting more wallpapered. It's brilliant. I love it. But if I get string, I might have to worry.
Yeah, that's when you've gone completely off the deep end.
Yeah, send help.
So, as we've sort of covered a little bit before, you've spent a few years working for Mathematics Mastery, an education company specialising in mathematics. It'd be really interesting to know, what did you learn, and would you recommend it to others?
I learned a huge amount in lots of different areas. I think primarily for me, I learned about different schools. So having taught in the same school for 6 years, it's in Norfolk, it's a lovely school. But we had, a quite homogenous group of homogenous cohorts. So I had never really experienced EAL pupils. Obviously I have met EAL pupils, but never in the sense that, I've now worked with schools who had, 97% EAL and who speak 30 different languages. And I'd never encountered anything like that before. I also have met a huge range of SEND pupils. And so I've had to think and tailor to more range of pupils than I would ever encountered in my career teaching. I've also met a diverse range of teachers. So I've worked with teachers who are unqualified. I've worked with teachers who have 30 years of experience and are a bit stuck in their ways and more resistant to change, and everywhere in between. So I think from that respect, it's a great way of seeing a massive range of schools all across the country, and the schools in Northern Ireland were a particular eye-opener because silly things like they don't get PPA. And I was like, how do you do all of, it's that kind of thing. You sort of realise how lucky you are to have just that time, because a lot of the schools in Northern Ireland didn't get that. It was interesting from silly points of view as well, because they say the word square differently. And so when I was talking to the children about shapes, they had no idea what I was talking about because I said square, and I'm not even going to attempt the accent, but it's much sort of smaller in the mouth, I suppose you'd say. And so it's very, so there was some language barriers, which are always interesting, considering we were all speaking the same language.
Vowels are very different, because even when I say shape, it sounds like ship. And so I have to really enunciate whenever I'm talking to kids over here. But any words with vowels in them are lots of vowels.
Yeah, I mean, I have that issue because I say graph rather than graph. And my Norfolk lovely children now are all saying graph, and it makes me so happy. But I think so in that respect, I think it was one of the best things I ever did. And in terms of my subject knowledge as well, it has meant, I think, and I don't know because I haven't tried, but I think if I ever wanted to be a regular classroom primary teacher, as in teaching all the subjects, I think that might be more of a challenge for me, because I'm now 5 years in, near enough, where I haven't taught anything except maths. But what I do know is that I've been able to spend all this time just thinking about maths. In Maths Mastery, we could spend 6 hours just talking about one tiny aspect of mathematics. I got to write an entire scheme of work essentially for year 6. I got to write 100 lessons for year 6 and plan it all and resource it all and sequence it all. And so those experiences, I think I would never have got any other way. And I don't think I would be in the job I'm in now if it wasn't for that experience. And for me, it reinvigorated my want to teach. I think I said earlier, I got to the point after 6 years where I wasn't sure that teaching was for me. And now I absolutely love my job again. And, and I think it took those 4 years out where I was teaching adults essentially and advising to make me realise that this is what I'm passionate about, this is what I'm good at. And actually now I'm teaching just maths and then spending the rest of my day thinking about a curriculum is just brilliant. So I think you asked me if I'd recommend it. I think yes and no. I think if you know in yourself that actually what you want to do is do something specialised, then I think working for an organisation that specialises in an area can only be a good thing. Because what I've learned is I don't think I'd have learned it any other way. Even going through the NCTM or anything like that, I don't think I'd have the knowledge that I do. However, I think if you do have, if you want to go into SLT in a primary school or do anything that requires you to have a really good knowledge of all the different subjects, then perhaps this isn't the path for you, because, I happily admit that my geography knowledge is not good enough to teach primary geography anymore, and I'm okay with that. But yeah, I think so. It depends on what you want to do with your life, I think.
Yeah, I think that the bar's definitely been raised in terms of what teachers are expected to know in terms of the wider curriculum. And I'm not even sure where Surrey and Sussex are. I know they're around about Kent, but I thought the whole thing was Kent for a long time. So my geography.
I have a whole grey area. So I know the bottom of the country and I know where London is, but there's a whole band across between below London and above Portsmouth, Bognor Regis, Devon, Cornwall. I have no idea what happens there. Not a clue. But I'm okay with that. Yeah. North of England, I'm fine. But yeah, and I just think, teachers are required to know so much. Primary teachers are expected to be experts in every single subject. And if you can find a person like me or like yourself, Kieran, who has got that, deep knowledge of one subject, and you can get them in your school or in your trust or whatever, it can just make such a difference for maths teachers, for primary teachers, sorry. Because if I can help them out with these connections and with this language and with great ways to teach maths, it just means that they still have to think about it, but they can concentrate developing their subject knowledge on, I don't know, where these strange places that aren't Kent are, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I'd love us to adopt a specialist model, because I've seen it work in other countries, and maybe teach 2 or 3 subjects. They teach maths and 2 of the sciences, perhaps, because I think you'd probably get a lot more people coming into teaching because they're teaching solely about what they're passionate about. But
yeah,
who am I to dictate government policy at the minute? We'll see one day.
I worked with an academy chain in London who did exactly that, and it meant that they could teach a wider range of the wider curriculum. So they had someone who had specialised in Latin, and so they were teaching the kids Latin, and they had someone else who was doing had done ancient history as a degree, and so they were doing that, and it was fabulous. And I know it wouldn't necessarily work for everybody, and you would have to have teachers that we couldn't all apply to your school because we're all good at maths. But yeah, I think there is power in allowing the freedom to teach in that way, particularly in Key Stage 2, having that balance between the teacher, like you're not having 17 different teachers or whatever it might be. So they've got that continuity in terms of they're seeing the same adult regularly, but having specialisms is I think can only be a good thing.
Yeah, maybe one day, you never know.
Who knows? We'll change the world, Kieran. We'll
And so at the minute you are leading maths across several schools. Tell me about the pros and cons of such a role.
I think I've talked a bit about the pros sort of generally, but I think for me it's just being able to teach maths. So I teach maths currently in one of the schools and 4 mornings a week, and that's with 2-year groups who have been identified as being a bit more challenging in terms of their subject knowledge. So I've been working really hard to develop those. And it's just wonderful. I love going in and teaching, and I've still gotten to know them. I've still built those relationships. But it's just meant that I can focus on that and then swan off and do other things. And I think the pros as well is although the Inspiration Trust is obviously, it's a trust, all the schools are very different. So they have some commonalities, but they're very individual. And I love that. And I love being able to think carefully about, the positives that are coming out of all the different schools and how individual they are. And that's just brilliant. I think the biggest con is has been noticed in the last few weeks, really, as I have gotten to know the schools more. There are only 5, so it's not a huge number of schools, but there are certainly 4 of them who could really do with me regularly, so could really do with my time regularly. And so the biggest challenge, I think, is not having multiple me's. There is only one of me, and so I want to go and spend time in all of the schools, and I can't. I just physically, there isn't enough hours in the day. They're not massively geographically distanced, so they're sort of within driving distance. But it is a real challenge, I think, to be able to do that. And also with obviously the current pandemic situation, it's not easy for me to get into schools because I teach 2 classes. It's then, I can't start bursting bubbles and everything else. I could be responsible for sending the entire trust home. It hopefully will be a bit easier after Christmas. But yeah, I mean, next week, for example, I've got 3 different conversations with 3 different schools, and I'm pretty sure they're all going to say to me, we need some of your time. And I've then got to try and work out how to do that. And I'm going to disappoint somebody because I can't physically be everywhere. So I think that's the biggest con, is just having, I want to be able to do everything all at the same time, but I've always been like that, and I can't. And so accepting that I can't has been challenging.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that. And even if I don't spend 2 days in the school, I'll feel like I'm starting to forget what it was like there. And so I want to go back and stuff.
Yeah. And also one of the schools is less priority to the trust because they're in, I say they're a new school, they're relatively new. So they don't yet have year 6 pupils. And obviously, data for some people is very important. And so they're sort of, and they're very, they're sort of leafy suburbs, they're kind of the school that if you're going to rank schools on ones you need to worry about, they'd be lower in the list. But at the same time, I don't want them to feel like I'm forgetting about them or that they're not important to me. I want them to feel that I do care about them. But at the same time, there are schools that really need my support for lots of different reasons. But they don't in terms of, the need, but I don't want to forget about them either. So it's that, again, it's a huge balancing act. And I think I'll feel guilty whatever I do. And I'm sure you do as well. You kind of feel guilty if you don't support a particular teacher or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I really like the sound of your trust in the fact that then all the schools are different, because that's one of the, I think that's really important because, I've got 2 schools that are less than a mile away from each other and they couldn't be more different in terms of how they see maths. And if I were to just say, right, plonk, here's the way we're doing it, it totally wouldn't work. Whereas, so I really like the sound of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the Inspiration Trust as a trust has a cloudy reputation in some respects. I think, it's one of those things where often decisions that have been made are negatively represented in the press. You don't necessarily hear about all the wonderful things that happen. And actually they are, as a trust, what I really like about them is they are completely committed to developing children in Norfolk, and as a Norfolk girl myself, I was born in Kings Lane, the county as a whole, and I mean massively broad strokes, but we have a lot of seasonal workers, we have a lot of low aspirations, we have a lot of we have a lot of people, a lot of families who have been there for generations, and I'm not saying Norfolk's any different to lots and lots of other places in the country. But what I like about the trust is the fact that they are really committed to giving kids the knowledge and the opportunities to change that if they want to, and for me, that's really powerful. I was given the opportunity to interview for a Cambridge University when I was in sixth form. Didn't get in, not bothered about that. But the fact that I had that opportunity was just phenomenal. And actually being able to give these children the opportunity to learn maths in a way that is useful and just, it's just a really wonderful thing. So I think that, the trust is doing brilliant things. And I'm really glad that they're focusing on their primary schools now and allowing us to shine in our own ways as well.
So reading is clearly a passion of yours. How did you get into edubooks in particular?
I'd like to say it wasn't, but it was Craig Barton's book. So Craig Barton's How I Wish I Taught Maths. It was doing the rounds in the Maths Mastery office, and I thought I'd have a read. So I was aware of him and his podcast, and so I thought I'd read it. And what I liked about it was how accessible it was, and it made me realise that, and I think I'll loop back to this point because I know we're going to talk about research as well. It made me realise that not all educational books were inaccessible, and that you could take things from it. And so basically I read his book and made a list of all the other books that I wanted to read. And then I read Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? I read neuroscience books and those kind of things as well, and then it just kind of spiraled from there. And after I read Craig's book, I mean it's a big old book, and there's a lot of words in there. I thought to myself, well, actually I've read this and I've taken a lot away from it. Why don't I tell people about it? And so the blog was born, and then again I've been lucky in the sense that some people, including yourself, have sent me some lovely books to read. A couple of publishers have been very generous with their kind of copies as well. And it's just grown from there, really. So I've read a lot of books on a range of subjects, predominantly maths, because obviously I'm a maths person. But that Craig Barton's was the start of it all, really. And he has opened my eye. And then obviously I read his other book, and that led to more books and so on and so forth.
Nice. I think the field's definitely changed over the last 10 years. Like you say, more books that are easily digested, while teaching full-time in the classroom. And taking things that are really pretty complex and making them accessible is really important. So, yeah, I think there's definitely a place for the academic terms, but sometimes you just need something that's going to help you with your teaching and learning, because because I've got, like, we've trying to collect a CPD library, and then we can just point teachers towards chapters that'll help them, alongside modeling and stuff like that there. So that's cool.
Yeah.
And it's a really good situation. We've got publishers sent you books that you would have bought anyway. But
oh, absolutely, yeah. And I make the point of I don't tend to read a book that, like, say, I wouldn't read normally, and I also I try to accept the fact that although I don't necessarily get something from a book, that doesn't mean no one else will. So when I review books, I do try and stay as positive as I can, because I accept the fact that although there's been two in particular that I just really didn't enjoy, didn't get anything out of, that doesn't mean that nobody will. And if I'm reviewing it, I need to bear that in mind. So I try and be nice about things.
Yeah, and I suppose that's fair enough. And I think when you get to a certain level of expertise, you do have to keep in mind that not everybody has had the luxury of our experiences and stuff, So
absolutely,
how would I have seen that when I was a novice? Yeah, because sometimes I feel like I'm reading the same thing, for the 100th time, but actually, I've had the luxury of going to different conferences and doing that. Yeah, so that makes total sense. And so research, you mentioned it briefly. One of the things I like to ask people to do is talk about their research thunderbolt, which is the paper that stopped the world, and the scales fell from your eyes, and you realized that research informed practice was something that you had to get involved in.
So for me, it's not one particular paper, but it's people. So I hope that's okay. If not, tough. So what I was thinking a lot about this, actually, and when I did an English degree, and then I did a PGCE, and I am sure that I read research papers during both of those things. I'm sure that must have happened. I can't remember a single one of them. And then I went through my career of teaching and didn't really read any educational papers. And then I joined Mathematics Mastery, where it's kind of expected that you read stuff. And so the people that did this thunderbolt for me were Mike Askew, Anne Watson, John Mason, and Dave Hewitt. So Dave Hewitt was the first one, really, only because I came across his paper first on arbitrary and necessary information in maths. And the reason they're all my thunderbolts is because all of them write research, write educationally informed pieces that are in English, that I can understand. I've read stuff. I was made to read during my time at Mathematics Mastery a piece by, I think his first name's Raymond. It's Duval. Anyway, it's all about representation. And genuinely, it gave me a headache. It took me like 5 hours to read it. It gave me a headache. I had to look up every fifth word. And it's just not accessible, and actually, if you read Watson and Mason stuff, particularly on variation theory, it just makes sense. And so it was that realization that I could read research and understand it. It was things that I could read and understand, and things that I could make sense of, and things that I could then apply immediately. Like Duval's piece, don't get me wrong, it has changed the way I think about things. But it's taken me, I read it probably 2 years ago, and I'm now thinking about it now and thinking, oh yeah, okay, I can do that. Whereas, Askew, Hewitt, Watson, Mason, just, it makes sense. and I can do stuff with it. And they've cut through all this fancy language, and there is a place for long words, don't get me wrong, but I'm an English graduate and I still didn't understand some of the things that people were talking about. And I think it puts you off. And so for me, the thunderbolt was realizing that the academics who I respect and academics who know their stuff can also write in a way that is accessible to, again, thinking about teachers, like you said, like novice teachers who don't necessarily know what subitizing means or what a subtrahend is. They can still write stuff that those teachers can understand. And that for me is my thunderbolt, the fact that it's not all doom and gloom and long words.
Nice. Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And you'd be hard pressed to find a better and more influential list than the one you just given.
Honestly, I mean, Duval's work is fascinating. It's it's all about making connections between representations, essentially, and he basically says that you can't understand any aspects of maths without representing it, which that's not the groundbreaking particularly. I mean, we all kind of know that, but then he talks about conversions and treatments. So the idea that you can, if you're really skilled in thinking about representation, like different numbers, for example, in different representations, then you become really skilled at manipulating those, and therefore you become very skilled at calculating with things. And that, I mean, I am completely like ruining the nuances of what he says, and it's it's very wonderful. But there were words there that it just gave me a headache, and I had to read sentences several times to understand what was going on. And I think that, I'm not knocking people who write in that way, because actually that's fine. But I think for primary practitioners in particular, we need things, like you say, we're time poor. We need things that we can access and understand without having to plow through it and, get our teeth into it too much.
Yeah. Have you checked out, do the Charter College do like little, I suppose, no, Cambridge Maths is the better example. They do their espressos.
Yes. I love
those
them.
Are fantastic. I think they had one on the crocodiles, which was quite timely. maybe it was the equality symbol. But obviously there was that big conversation on equivalence.
Yes, it was on I've seen that on Twitter recently, the equality, the is equal to symbol, and whether you should be saying equals or is equal to, and all that kind of thing. And I think that's it, the equal sign, or whatever you want to call it, is something that we spent at Maths Mastery. We debated for forever, and we could spend hours and hours and hours on it. Actually, primary teachers in the classroom don't have hours and hours and hours to debate it. They need something like espresso that just tells them what the best ideas are, what is best practice. That's what we need.
Nice. And so hopefully we'll be able to get you to stick to a paper on this one. Is there a paper that you think every primary teacher simply must read? It doesn't have to be mathematics based, it can be anything.
It is math. Well, it's maths based. So for me, it's Anne Watson's Variation Unplugged. The reason being is that in my travels across schools, variation has been a word that has come up more and more and more, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, certainly in primary. And the problem with it, like mastery, like conceptual understanding, like a million and one other words, is that it's been really, really misunderstood. And, for me, variation and setting tasks, whether you want to call that purposeful practice or whether you want to call it whatever you want to call it, there are so many different names these days as well. Actually, the fundamentals behind variation are something I think that can be incredibly powerful for all teachers. I think that used properly, it can inspire mathematical thinking and reasoning. I think it can challenge your higher attainers while allowing slower grasping children lots and lots of practice. It can encourage pattern seeking, generalization. It can do all of these amazing things, and yet it is so misunderstood. And so, or misused, or someone finds a great variation task and just throws it at children without any thought. And so for me, Variation Unplugged really thinks about the fundamentals of what variation is. So you could go away and read the other papers, by those people that kind of coined variation. But actually, Anne Watson, again, just cuts through all the nonsense, and she talks about the fact that yes, we can have conceptual variation, and we can have procedural variation, and we can have fusion and all these other weird and wonderful terms, but actually what we're talking about is the changing one thing, the variation and an invariant background. And I think it was that paper, I'd read a huge amount on variation beforehand because it was something that we were developing in Maths Mastery, and then I read that. And for me, it just turned everything. It's almost my thunderbolt, but not my thunderbolt, because it couldn't be both. It just made sense to me, and it just helped me understand. And again, it was something, and the reason I think all primary school teachers should read it is because I think the implications of variation can be really far-reaching. It can be used in other subjects. It's not just a maths thing. And it's something that is relatively short, which is always nice. It is written in relatively easy to understand lexicon, so it's not something that you have to have a dictionary next to you. And I just think that it allows you to see that often what you think you're doing as variation, or what you're being sold as variation, is not variation. And so therefore it can allow you to think about what it actually is and what it actually means. And so for me, I think everyone should read it.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I think Anne writes in a way that, like you say, engages and makes things make a whole lot of sense. And in my experience, I think variation's almost too young a field. It's still trying to define itself. You've almost got different sort of factions discussing what it means to them. And I think, teachers need to sort of start taking, well, what might it look like? What do those principles look like in practice? And that should be our focus, because then we won't have worksheets with variation written on them when there's little to no variation in them. But what we will have is, because I think like, obviously, I'm almost a cliche or a parody of myself, but thinking about think about those principles when you're designing a task is almost more important than if you do it correctly or not. I think, because over time you're going to get a more refined process. Yeah, I'm totally with you. Yeah, and I think
I agree. And I think reading Chris McGrain's book, Mathematical Task Book, was that kind of similar idea. There's that, and then obviously you've got Reflect, Check, whatever it's called, by Craig Barton. I can never remember the order it goes in. And all of those things I think point towards the power of variation. But I think if you don't fundamentally understand what actually the purpose of it is, then, like you say, you end up just calling it variation, and it's not. And I've seen things that are in the trust stuff that's called intelligent variation, and there's nothing intelligent or varied about it. And so it's that misunderstanding. And I think that if you then read Anne Watson's paper, you can understand what you mean by it, and you can actually then look at it more critically and go, well, is it that? And if it's not that, don't call it that. And then work out, like you say, what it is for you and what it means for you.
Nice. Excellent. So then the last thing is a tier list.
I'm excited about this.
Yeah, so behind each of those doors we have 6 concrete resources, concrete manipulatives, that can be used in maths lessons. And so anything above B is a good show. S is your sensational, seminal, and C is below average in your opinion. Just sort of, and then talk us through your decisions. So we've got concrete resources that you might see in the math classroom, and the first one is base 10 equipment, often called Dean's equipment, but I thought his name was Zoltan Dinesh, so it should be Dinesh equipment.
I was told that it was Dehenes. Yeah, I say Dean's because that's me. But yes, base 10 Dean's equipment. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think I would go for sort of the second tier down. So not like God tier, but what's the A stand for?
Well, I think it's just in order of
Awesome.
yeah, it could be. Anything above B is superb. So
Yeah, great. And I think this because the power that base 10 has is very much around the idea of the relationship in our base 10 system, you know, and I think that's something that is overlooked, particularly in Key Stage 2. I think we get to the point where we decide that they know that, you know, 10 ones is 110 and so on and so forth, and we don't have to actually look at that anymore. And Bernie Westacott, he did a workshop recently where he just opened my eyes to actually the importance of, I mean, I knew it was important, but the extra importance of it. And I think that, you know, it needs to be used and manipulated with all the way up to year 6. The other thing I love about it as well is that we can reassign the values. So if, you know, the 1,000 cube, becomes 1, we can then represent our decimal number system. And that is one of the best things I ever learned to do in terms of teaching decimals and the relationship between tenths, hundredths and thousandths and all the rest of it. So yeah, for me, they're not the best thing in the world. They have their limitations. The biggest limitation, I think, the reason they're not above A is that you can't, with most of them, I've seen some where you can, but you can't break the 10.
Yeah.
So the biggest limitation for me is that I've seen these being used in, say, year 1, where they've talked about regrouping and so on. And so you've got, you know, 10 ones is 110, but actually the fact that you can't physically break that 10 stick into 10 ones and, you know, all the others, I think is a challenge. And I think it's the only drawback. I have since realised that some of them you can do that, but yeah, I think that's the only drawback that I have with them.
Yeah, I think size, you know, once you get past a certain number, the tables and big enough.
Oh, can you imagine trying? Yeah, that's, yeah. We built, within Mathematics Mastery, we built a 1,000,000 cube. We didn't have enough Dean's thousands blocks to make it, but we made like the dimensions of it because we wanted, because it's obviously that visualizing that magnitude.
Yeah.
So we made the sort of frame of one to see how big it was, and we could fit inside it, and there was all this stuff going on, and which is lovely if you've got enough of those thousands blocks to play with. But yeah, I think you get to a point, it's great for the magnitude, and if you can build things like that to see what's going on, then that's brilliant. But yeah, you do get to a point where it just becomes ridiculously impractical.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really useful tool, and Bernie's very, very good at if I think we're at explaining the importance of representation. So, you know, I can bet that workshop was, you know, top notch as always.
It was amazing.
So the next one are the 2-color counters. So I'm fully on board with 2-color counters because obviously they would have had, all counters are double-sided. so and yeah, Jonathan Hall and in his talks about 2-color counters, so I'm getting on board.
Oh, I've never thought about it like that. I've always called them double-sided. Oh, I'm going to stop now.
Me too. Yeah, and then it's all.
Okay, so for me, personally, they would have to go in the B column. The reason being is that I've been shown their use in terms of thinking about negative numbers, so 0 pairs, that kind of thing. But that isn't something that I would really think about in primary mathematics. And so it's kind of outside my expertise, really. I own some. I've used them for subtraction, but not very successfully. I think there are better models for subtraction. The best thing I've used them for is we did in year 5, we did the 100 lights problem or the 100 locks problem. So, you know, we have 100 lights and then person 1, they're all off. Person 1 comes along and turns them all on. Person 2 comes and turns every second one. Person 3 every third, and so on and so forth. So we did that. We did 25 lights because what it reveals is your factors, your multiples, your prime and square numbers. So we did it with that and it worked really well for those. But it has to go in that tier for me because I just don't know what else to do with them. And they're not as versatile, in my mind, as the Dean's blocks and things like that in primary.
Yeah, well, it's your tier list, so you put them where you think they best go. So our third is Numicon.
I'm going to be honest, I'm not a fan. So I would put it in C. Sorry, Numicon people. But I'll tell you why. The reason why is I get very irritated by people who use it for everything. That's my issue with it. And again, I think it's possibly a lack of understanding on my part. So I have had very limited experience with Numicon. I've worked in some schools that have had it, but not many schools that have had like the full-blown training and everything else on it. And I think then the problems are twofold. First of all, it becomes a resource that's only used in reception or year one. And I think there is absolutely power in using it for, I've seen amazing things done with like proportion and percentages and things like that. However, I just see it being shoehorned into everything. And I'm sure that the people who use it are amazing practitioners. And I don't mean to, I'm going to like alienate like everyone who listens to this now. But for me, I think some people can get so stuck on using one resource and therefore are limiting their pupils' perceptions and understandings of the relationships in mathematics and the kind of the different ways of representing. So going back to what Duval says, you need to have lots of different representations so you can manipulate it. And actually for me, I think Numicon is overused by some people. So yeah, it's going there. Sorry, Numicon lovers.
Yeah, no, it's not necessarily Numicon's fault, but more the way it's been sort of.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's like lots of things. It's the way that it's been used and interpreted. It's not Numicon's fault. I'm sure if I had proper training, I would see the benefits of it and I'd be telling everyone to use it for everything. But for me personally, not my thing. Yeah,
well, I think different manipulatives have different sort of features that bring strength or weakness to them. Like, for instance, Numicon is rigid. You know, once it's a 5, it's a 5. And it's almost like the base 10 equipment that don't, you know, in that situation, you want to have multi-link cubes that you can make 10 and break 10 with, you know, in different ways. Yeah. You know, so that's just not its skill set. You know, it does lots of stuff really well, but it doesn't do everything. No manipulative does
No, that's true.
Yeah. So
I also saw some people use it for fractions once, and it just, it made me a bit sad. So I try and I'm not a fan, but like you say, it's often how I've perceived it rather than, you know, invite me to someone's school who does it brilliantly and I'll go.
Well, like I say, I think in tandem with other resources at the same time, I think. You know, I mean, I think even the people who sort of do Numicon training would agree with you on that one.
Yeah.
So then we got place value counters.
They are going to go in the same tier as the Dean's equipment. For similar reasons, really. I think they have the advantage over Dean's in, as you said earlier, these can be used to represent Mahusive numbers quite easily. And I think they're really good for showing the multiplicative aspect of place value. So the fact that you've got 3 times 100 and so on and so forth for 312, say. But I think the drawback again is that inability, the fact that they're not sized. So, you know, the fact that your 100 is the same size as your 10 and the fact that you can't exchange or regroup them for different things, and that makes sense, and you can't break it up. I think that has the drawback. I think if you've got kids who are super duper uber secure in their place value understanding, then they can be really powerful. But I think a lot of kids aren't. For lots of reasons, and I think therefore that can be the drawback with them.
Yeah, you know, we almost have a transition between when the pupils are secure in their understanding of the relative magnitude to four digits, and that's the point when we think, right, okay, we can start to, because with the place value counters, it's almost a middle ground between the mental process and having something to manipulate, and so if pupils don't understand, like you say, then you really want them to get that sense of the magnitude. But and then they move on once they've done that. I think I think that's almost a skill in itself, is knowing what it is you're trying to get from, because they do essentially the same job, but in very different ways, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. They're the thing that I tend to use more of, particularly at the moment with the pandemic-y stuff going on. But I think it does rely on that, being able to understand what is going on with them. Like everything, like you say, everything has its limitations. No, nothing's perfect.
Yeah. The next one is Cuisenaire rods.
Cuisenaire rods are my favourite thing in the world, so they have to go in the top tier. I think the only caveat I have with this is if people don't understand them. So it's like me and Numicon. I put Numicon at the bottom because I probably don't understand it. And I think I think I could easily put Cuisenaire at the bottom because lots of people don't understand their use either. But I think the Cuisenaire rods are the most versatile of the representations that you've got here. The reason being is because they're proportional. They can be used for fractions, for decimals. You can use them with a place value chart for place value. You can use them for area, perimeter, a million and one things. I like the fact that you can use them to make area models for multiplication, but you can also put them in trains, as in like a long line of them. I think the limitation is that people often, and pupils, get really hung up on the idea of the number. So they assign the number 1 to the white rod and 10 to the orange rod, and that becomes really fixed in their brains. So I work really hard when I introduce Numicon to pupils. We don't talk about that, and we try and avoid that. And we talk about the colours and we talk about the relationships and so on and so forth, because I think they're particularly powerful for things like, if you decide the light green rod, which has length 3, which is the terms I tend to use, if that represents, 1, then what is the value of the other rods? And if you talk about the length 3, as in it's 3 times the value of the white rod, that is more powerful than saying it's worth a 3, because that then gets fixed in their heads and then they can't think about it in any other way. So you get kids talking about, if you're doing this with fractions, you talk about how the white rod is always a 10th, no matter what they're actually comparing it against. So for me, because I know all of that, and because I've thought about all of that, they are my favourite thing in all the world. I would use them for everything if I could, but obviously you can't. I do use other things. But I think in the wrong hands, they could be absolutely exchanged with Numicon.
Yeah. I think where would I go? Because I've definitely been there where I hadn't got a clue what these were. And I think, early years to adult, the ATM Cuisenaire book by Hannah Williams. Et al.
Yeah. There's a load of wonderful stuff in Visible Maths as well by Pete Mattock that deals with Cuisenaire rods. Twitter has really helped open my eyes to them as well. I've always loved them, but I think my understanding has deepened over time with thinking about, Simon Gregg, who he's just wonderful. So he does a whole load of wonderful stuff on Twitter, but he does a lot of work with Cuisenaire rods as well. So Simon Gregg.
Yeah, because I think he's in a school in Toulouse.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting explorations of mathematical ideas in his
books. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I think, any of those places are good to start. Mark McCord has a good bit in Teaching for Mastery.
Yeah.
Which covers it as well from almost more of a secondary point of view. But I think it's interesting. It's just getting out there and see. And then the last one's a bit out there. The last one is the Wreck and Wreck.
Yeah. I'm not sure I can place this because I know literally nothing about it other than that it's called a Wreck and Wreck. End of discussion. I don't know anything more. It's on my to-do list to learn about it. So as I was leaving Mathematics Mastery, we were just then starting to kind of realise what a Wreck and Wreck was. One of my colleagues made one with like cubes and wire and stuff. And I've seen them being kind of discussed on Twitter, but I've never touched a real life one. I don't really know a lot about them. So as far as I know, it's groups of 10, and you've got 5s and 5s.
Yeah.
Is that right? So for me, it's like a bead string, but in a grid. And I love a bead string, but I don't know what I would use this for that is different to what I would do with a bead string. So if I'm treating it like a bead string, it would go with deans and place value counters, but I'm not sure I can put it there because I don't actually know what it does.
No, yeah, I think it's akin to, but they've got a very interesting way of looking at the relationship between the beads and the numbers, and how, because you've got those two groups of 5, it almost feeds into being able to see 5 and some more.
5 and a bit, yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
But yeah, so let's leave it.
We have bead strings that go to 20 that do exactly that. You've got 20 in groups of 5, and I love the idea of being able to see 5 and a bit, because that's such a powerful mental representation, and then kind of helping you bridge through that 10. But for me, I don't know because I've not used one, but thinking about bridging through 10, if it's on a different level, then would I think about it in the same way that I would on a bead string? I don't know is the answer. Yeah. Might do, who knows? So that's on my to-do list. Ask me in a year when I've bought one and played with it. Let's
leave it unassigned for now, and then we'll come back to it in a year.
Yeah.
Awesome. So it's been really interesting talking to you about all things maths and education. Thank you very much for your time. It's been an awesome.
It's been a pleasure. It's really nice to have the opportunity to talk about primary maths. I think obviously there's lots of secondary podcasty type things around, and it's nice to have a primary version celebrating our wonderful community.
And there we have it, a truly fascinating chat full of superb insights into the world of primary education. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, follow, or leave a review, depending on where you're listening. And if you have any questions for any of my guests, head over to the Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics YouTube channel and leave a comment, and let the conversation continue long into the night. Until next time, thanks for listening.